I think it's pretty fair to say that the superhero genre has been inundated with women recently. All of media pretty much has, but the superhero genre in particular has gotten a really bizarre baptism into fourth wave feminism that is just incredibly strange. Back in the day, we used to have female heroes and female heroic characters that actually mattered to a plot, who went through a great deal of struggle in order to emerge victorious, who were brave because it was required of them, and sacrificial when it mattered. They faced stakes that were proportionate to their characters and near overwhelming odds that nearly killed them before somehow managing to pull out a win in the end. Yeah, we don't really get that anymore, and I kind of miss it. I can think of way too many examples in the last few years about female superheroes who have all but destroyed my desire to see any female-led films unless they are thoroughly vetted by another independent source. Whether they have destroyed my favorite female heroes like Black Widow, Scarlet Witch, and Wonder Woman by giving them incredibly dubious morals, or else just making a goofy film that is not honoring to the characters at all, I think it's safe to say that Hollywood at large and the individual media companies in particular have cheerfully and gleefully ruined female heroes. But why is that? Why, when we know what good female heroes look like, would they try so hard to do the opposite? Some of my guesses would be following the Star Wars model, where they simply wanted to attract as much female attention as possible, and so started throwing women into everything no matter how good or bad it was. They might have recognized that if they didn't do this, they would be behind on the culture, and in terms of social credit, being behind on the culture is never a great thing. So the decision was made to open the door to activists who were more invested in their own personal objectives that longtime fans, and even to an extent normies, loved. And the fallout of this has been displayed in profit margins, in public opinion, in online personalities, you name it. I've heard the word misogyny used time and time again as an excuse to explain away a lot of vitriol that we've been seeing from fans, and I really do think that that's just a comforting word to dismiss any of the discourse when it comes to the problems with female heroes. And make no mistake, there are a lot of them. For the purposes of this video, I want to discuss the three biggest ones. The ones that don't really touch things like narcissism or that are immediately obvious. This reason doesn't apply to every female character that has been on the big screen in the last 10 years, but a great many of them unfortunately subscribe to these problems. The first one is that there is a lack of story. Have you ever noticed that so many female superheroes these days just don't really have a character arc or an origin? They are either directly connected to someone from the Marvel Universe and are piggybacking off their story to make up their own, or their power origins can be explained in one sentence. Everyone knows the origin story of Spider-Man. He was a nerdy kid who was bullied in high school, who lived with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben because his parents weren't in the picture. He had a crush on MJ and was harassed by Flash. He was a typical high school student with typical problems who didn't really think about things like his identity. Instead, he tried his best to be a good student, a good friend, a good nephew, and someone with good integrity. After all, in the words of Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. This was a truth that Peter held dear and always remembered even after his uncle's death and Aunt May became his caretaker. After he was bitten by the spider, though he experienced moments of naivete, he remained humble and devoted himself to helping the city of New York despite his naysayers. Spider-Man also faced a lot of iconic villains like Doc Ock and the Green Goblin, villains who test him to his absolute limits and who enrich his character even further. The character of Peter Parker is so beloved because he is fully fleshed out and very wholesome. The female superheroes of the last 10 years or so, with exceptions of course, don't really have that. The story of characters like Monica Rambeau is that she walked through a wall created by Scarlet Witch and suddenly got light powers, and the audience doesn't really know how they work. We know that she was Carol's goddaughter and that her mom died during the snap, and that's really it. There's nothing about her character to bind her to the audience in a personal way. Nothing to cause fans to root for her or have a reason to care. She doesn't have any iconic lines that inform her character, or even a lot of hardships that she goes through to make her who she is. And after her bizarre and somewhat impersonal introduction in WandaVision, she's back 2.5 years later for her own movie, and people are expected to remember who she is, how her powers work, what she does, and try to come up with a reason as to why we should care about her. The apathy surrounding Monica Rambeau was strong enough, however, that I didn't really care when she was presumed dead, because I didn't know her. I didn't have a reason to care about her beyond what the marketing said, which was her identity as a strong female black character. The same problems crop up when you consider Jane Foster's Thor. which to this day is still a movie that enrages me because there was nothing entertaining or redeeming about it. We all know the origins of Jane Foster, as she's been around the MCU for over a decade. But in 2022, the producers decided that that wasn't enough and turned her into a god herself, taking the mantle of Mighty Thor because that's somehow just a title that can be passed on, as if her own name wasn't good enough. The only reason Jane became a goddess in the first place was because Thor asked the sentient hammer Mjolnir to protect her. As a result, the hammer now comes when she calls, gives her these unbelievable biceps, because magic fixes everything that exercise will not physically do, and gives her the ability to fight like any other 1,000-year-old Asgardian. There is no story to the character of Jane Foster's Mighty Thor, other than what Taika Waititi thought might be funny, and fortunately for the rest of us, no one did. With Jane's lack of hardships to becoming a goddess, why should any of us care about her? Why should she bear any thought in our minds at all? Yelena Belova is a bit more of a palatable character, but at the same time, she too doesn't have a unique origin story all her own. She's basically the younger sister of Natasha Romanoff, whose story was already cemented, and the writers were too lazy to give her one of her own before passing on the mantle. She's basically a less fleshed out Natasha with blonde hair, and the writers gave her one story to inform her character that terrible Solo movie before deciding, good enough, let's slap her in the costume and call it a day. And as much as Layla El Faouli was a character that I could have liked in the long run, she too doesn't really have much of an origin besides being Mark's wife and somehow knowing how to fight a grown man. We don't know where her training came from, and somehow the writers decided that this would be enough to make her an avatar and call her an Egyptian superhero. That line from the finale is really the only reason that Layla exists as she does in Moon Knight. She was there for the purposes of representation and nothing else. She's not insufferable like a lot of other female superheroes are these days, but she certainly doesn't have a story or much of a reason for the audience to care about her. She didn't need to be in the show at all. Though female characters aren't really heroes due to their lack of origin stories, another reason that they are kind of terrible is a more malicious one. And that's spite. I have seen way too many women superheroes exist in the last few years simply for the purposes of vengeance or proving the haters wrong to think that it's a coincidence. The most recent example of this is the character of Echo, whose powers in the comics were similar to Taskmaster's and were actually pretty neat. Instead, for the purposes of representation, Echo now has the ability to mimic the powers of her female indigenous ancestors across the centuries, which she somehow learns how to do in the span of 30 seconds. Crazy, weird, unexplained, and unrealistic powers aside, Echo is just not a hero. She exists for the purposes of diversity and representation, and her entire character is built on the premise of revenge. Revenge for the death of her mother, revenge for the people who killed her father, revenge against Kingpin, revenge against her grandmother who she believes wronged her, revenge, revenge, revenge. Now don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great revenge stories out there. Everybody loves a story of retribution. But the one thing that those movies all have in common is the nature of the main character who has been wronged. They are always innocent in some way. They are this way for the purposes of the audience relating to them. If we think, what would the average person like myself do if we were pushed to our absolute limits and wronged for no reason other than greed or jealousy or power pushing? What if we were simply a stumbling block in some other person's quest for power or happiness, and they did away with us without a second thought simply because we were there and we existed? It's not a very pleasant thought at all, and the best revenge stories are the ones where the main character has been grievously wronged and done absolutely nothing to deserve it, like Gladiator. But to put a character on screen who is a known murderer, has killed dozens of people as a crime lord's hitman, and who has shown no remorse for it, and doesn't even acknowledge it, we're supposed to believe that person is heroic? Echo has no purpose beyond revenge and power grabbing. She all but states it outright in the show. We don't even know why she wants power and are simply told to believe that she is some sort of hero simply because she defeated Kingpin with the power of his memories? That's not a good revenge story. That's not even really a story at all, and yet Marvel would have us believe that these characters are virtuous simply for their gender and skin color. We could use the same argument for Riri Williams as well, a genius college kid who only exists because the Marvel comic writers decided they needed a more diverse Iron Man, and it had created her as existing purely on spite. Her teacher said that she would never be Iron Man, and so she spent her life proving him wrong. Riri Williams exists only for the purposes of owning the haters and nothing else. She exists only for the purposes of black girl magic, and she will be forever mocked for it. The same is true for She-Hulk, who claims that superhero stuff is for billionaires and narcissists. The entire plot of the She-Hulk show is Jennifer Walters owning all men simply for the crime of existing. She exists to humiliate Bruce Banner and claims that being catcalled is the most degrading thing that she could ever experience. Not only that, but she loudly and proudly states to Bruce that she is infinitely better at controlling her temper than him. Sure, sweetheart, because a man who dealt with abuse his entire childhood, was hunted down like an animal by the father of the love of his life, and didn't even have the ability to end his suffering through suicide because his alter ego wouldn't let him, doesn't know anything about controlling his temper. The narcissism and spite that exists within the She-Hulk show is simply astounding to me, even 2 years later. Every single one of these characters has no purpose beyond getting up on a soapbox and screaming about how unfair life is, or else putting all of their haters in the ground. It is an incredibly petty and shallow form of storytelling and demonstrates the breadth of life experience that everyone who put these shows and movies together has. That is to say, none. But spite isn't the last reason that female heroes these days are almost entirely terrible. The third and final explanation is their preference for dubious morals. The most foundational pillar of being a superhero is that your morals have to be above reproach. You can be a flawed character, but once your values turn a certain way, you cease to exist as a person that people can look up to and become a superpowered being to be feared. This sort of character rot began in Captain Marvel in 2019, when Carol Danvers subjected the entire Kree nation to a slow death by starvation, air pollution, and loss of light from their sun. Now, we don't see the long-term effects of this action until the Marvels 4 years later, but apparently when Carol said she's coming to end the lies, she was coming to end a lot more than that, too. As a result of her ill-thought-out decision, hundreds of people have died, and this saw the rise of Dar-Ben, who declared Carol a traitor and decided to take back habitation on their planet by any means necessary. By the time this was revealed in the movie, I had no problems with Dar-Ben simply taking out Carol and letting that be the entire film. It would certainly be more interesting than what we got. No one seemed to think that it wouldn't be a good idea to portray the next leader of the MCU in such a way. No one also seemed to consider the idea that it might not be a good look to have Captain Marvel away for such world-ending events like the Chitauri attack in New York or the Ultron incident in Sokovia. Everyone seemed to think it was just okay for her to not be in Earth's atmosphere and spend 20+ years wandering around the galaxy resettling the Skrulls. Captain Marvel is supposed to be the Earth's hero and defend the planet, and yet she abandoned it for a people whose greatest ability is impersonation, and is now a murderer responsible for genociding the Kree Nation. Wanda Maximoff is a character that really irks me too, because she was one of my favorites, and she has been utterly ruined by the writers. From going from Ultron's side to joining the Avengers to help save the country, losing her brother, falling in love, and then having to kill Vision to prevent Thanos from getting the last Infinity Stone, Wanda had an incredible character arc. I was so excited for WandaVision because I was really eager to see more of her, but as the story continued to progress, it really revealed just how awful of a character Wanda had become. From mentally enslaving an entire town and forcing them to think her thoughts, tormenting them with her nightmares, to erecting a barrier so that people are essentially in a prison camp, Wanda has sunk almost irreparably low as a character. Not only that, however, but the man who wants to see her answer for her crimes against the town is made out to be the villain by the strong, diverse female hero who has the audacity to claim that Wanda's actions are not nearly as bad as they are, and laud her as heroic when she finally let the townspeople go. Same thing for Carly Morgenthau, who is technically the villain of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but the writers tried so hard to make her out to be a victim, even to the point of having Sam, the new Captain America, side with international terrorists over peace, justice, law, and order. Oh, and we can't forget about Wonder Woman in 1984, when Diana knowingly and willingly sleeps with a man who has Steve Trevor's face, even though he is not in fact Steve Trevor. She sexually assaults a man, all because he is wearing the same skin as her dead lover. We don't have to look that far into shows like Echo to see the dubious and outright egregious lack of morals there either. You can't make stuff like this up, people. And yet the writers have, because morals are old-fashioned, virtues are outdated, and doing the right thing for the right reasons has become outmoded. I really do miss the days when female characters were heroes simply because they did the right things, were heroic because it was the right thing to do, and protected people weaker than themselves because stuff like that mattered. How did we get here? I don't really understand how women have become so hated in media that they would knowingly be turned into the worst versions of themselves, all in the name of power, control, and sexual freedom. I can only be somewhat thankful that the audience sees through nonsense like this immediately and continuously and hilariously calls it out as often as I see it. And as much as it may seem redundant, we need to keep doing it. It's the only way to take female characters back. It's the only way we're going to see change, even if it takes a while. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. What are your thoughts on the degradation of female superheroes, and who is your least favorite? Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comment section, and let the conversations begin. Until next time, everyone.